Hi, good evening everyone. Welcome to the 10th module of Introduction to Web Programming. And today we're going to talk about Introduction to CSS. So we're going to talk about cascading style sheet, what they are, right? How do you work with them? Find practically how do you deal with creating a CSS, what different types of CSS are there, and we're going to also talk about CSS ecosystem, right? So why learn CSS? So when we talk about cascaded style sheet, these are sheets which contain your styles, right? Now the reason why these are given to you because they offer different advantages, right? You have the first advantage, and the first advantage is reusability. That's the first very use of why we use CSS. So not only from reusability, it gives you better code maintenance, so maintainability improves, right? Then you have CSS to increase your readability, find readability, or the way that the coder understands the what styles are being applied, it improves that. So you have different advantages when you work with CSS. So till now we talked about HTML and HTML5, fine, but on the first day when we discussed on web as the platform, right, we said that there are three fundamentals on which this web programming is fundamental as a present is dependent on. First is HTML, second is CSS, and third is JavaScript. Now we have inherently used some CSS in the form of Bootstrap, so we're going to talk about it today and as we move ahead. But I've not shown you any styling which can be done. Yes, what we have used are called as inline styling. So we'll just get started with it. Now this course is brought to you by OdinSchool, which is a technology upskilling platform, and we help you to continuously acquire new skills so that you stay skilled and stay ahead. Hi, welcome back. I'm Sumit Vijay Vajpayee. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer. I've been delivering trainings on Microsoft technologies and latest web technologies from past 14 years. I'm a mean, moon, and full stack technology expert. Right? So the agenda for the day is what is CSS? Fine, so we're going to talk in more detail of it. Then what are the different types of CSS? Find out how I can go back and create different types. Find in what ways I can consume CSS into my HTML page. That's what we're going to discuss. And we're also going to talk about the CSS ecosystem. Right? Now let's understand why do we need CSS. Now if you focus more on what styling we have been using, right, with CSS, you will, or rather any styling that we are using with our HTML tags, okay, till now, you'll always see that we are been working with what we call as inline styling. So let's say if I do want to have some styling being achieved for, let's say, a div tag, right? Now here, if I'm writing a div, so this div tag will have style attribute, and in this style I would go back and specify the key and the value, right? So maybe if you want to set the border, you can go back and specify this border and then give the value of it. I'll say 2 pixel solid and then red in color, right? So that's the style. Now we can still go back and make use of this style. Now this what we are using is called as inline styling, right? So this is inline styling. Okay, now this inline styling helps us to have very simple things being achieved, right? For example, if you want all the CSS properties, now these CSS properties also predefined, right? So if I'm saying, okay, I want to set the border, I want to set some background, I want to set something, these CSS properties are also defined by default, and you are trying to make use of them so that you tell the browser that how do we need to have this styling being done, right? Now when we say that we are using the style attribute that HTML5 gives you, right, as I said, we are working with what we call as inline styling, right? But the thing with inline styling is you would see a problem that right now it's a single div tag, okay, that we are using. But what if there are other several div tags? So let's say there are 10 div tags in total, or let's say 100 div tags, just to exaggerate, in your application and in your web page, and in the web page all these 10 div tags should have the same styling let's say border has 2 pixels, solid red in color. Now if 100 div tags have to be created, right, they all have to be having this inline styling. So they need to point to this inline styling, and they need to have this border 2 pixels and solid red being copy pasted. Yes, we did that. So we went ahead, created 100 div tags, right? And in that 100 div tags, I just had the same style. Maybe the content are different because that's what I'm using this 100 div tags for. But I may want the border to be same, which is 2 pixels solid red in color. But then we decide not to have solid as the border style. But let's say I want to have dashed as the border style. Now if I want dashed as a border style for every of these items, for the 100 divs that we are having in, I need to actually go back and make the change to every div that is there, and I need to go back and change from solid to dashed, and I have to make 100 changes for every div tag that I've written, and I have to physically do that. So maybe you can search for it, you can find it, and maybe solid change to dashed, you can just replace. But soon this becomes difficult in maintenance, talking about reusability or talking about maintainability, right? Now if I say, okay, this style that you have used is for a particular item, what if I want a different styling for other div tags? So maybe 10 div tags I want border 2 pixels dash and red, for other 10 div tags I want border 2 pixels solid and black, right? So this is not reusable by default, and that's the reason why we ideally, even though we have used it till now, fine, but ideally we do not go back and make use of this style tag because it is not reusable, fine. So there is no reusability, fine. It is not maintainable, fine. It's also because it's tagged into it, it's not increasing any readability, right? It's not even increasing any readability. So, and that's the reason why we ideally do not use inline styling. We use it in some cases. I'll tell you what that case is, and that's the reason why we require cascaded style sheet. Okay. Now these cascaded style sheet allow you to have all these advantages. So you have reusability, so that you have maintainability, and you have readability as well, right? Now you may have used some of the basic things. If not, you have not done it, we will see in this session. So please make sure that you are in sync with what you're discussing. So we have discussed till now what is CSS, fine. So CSS stands basically for cascaded style sheet, fine. And this cascading or cascaded style sheet is something, now we'll discuss on why it's named as cascaded, fine. So why it is style sheet, fine, as well. So don't worry about it, but you can just understand that it is something, okay, which contains styling corresponding to our HTML tags and HTML elements. So it is CSS which basically makes our tag appear in a better way, and that's what the developer use CSS for, better presentability of any HTML tag that you're having, right? Now we're going to discuss on different types of CSS as well, fine. So don't worry about that. I'll just clear this off so that we move on to the next slide, which is what is CSS. So cascading style sheets or cascaded style sheets is a simple mechanism for adding styles, fonts, colors, spacing, margin, padding, fine, to web documents, okay, which is our HTML element. CSS is the language used to describe how HTML elements should be displayed, right? That's what CSS is. So there are two types. One is internal and second is external. Now what do you mean by these is, when we talk about making use of internal style sheets, so internal style sheets, they are referred into a simple .html page, right? Sorry. Next slide. Yeah. So in the CSS, when we talk about different styling, you have internal CSS. Now in this internal CSS, what we normally specify is we actually try to code all the styling in a .html page, right? And in this .html page, we dedicatedly put it into the style section. So all the rules that you need to put up in the CSS needs to go into the style tag in the same HTML page that you're wanting to use. And that's what is an internal CSS. So internal CSS, fine, or an inline CSS as well, if you want to call it, then this inline CSS is something which is contained inside your style section, fine. So style as an HTML tag is only dedicated for CSS. You cannot have any HTML tag inside it, right? So like we discussed on the second day, different types of tags which are available, fine. So we have tags which are semantic tags, okay, then we have the container tags, okay, then we have the presentational tags, fine, which were formatting tags which were there, okay, and programming tag like script, fine. On the same lines, style is a CSS tag, fine, where we can have all the CSS styling being done, right? So that's present inline, and we'll talk about when to use internal or when to use inline CSS. And the second type is external, and external is something which is done by writing a dedicated .css file, right? In this dedicated .css extension, fine, we go back and only write the style rules, fine. We do not write the style tag. So here we said style tag is what contains the style rules. We'll talk about selectors in a moment, fine. So these style rules are present into the style tag directly, but with external CSS you do not make use of the style tag, but you directly have the style rules present in this .css file. That's how you make use of a CSS. So there are two types of CSS. One is an internal CSS which is present into a simple HTML page, okay, which contains a style tag, and then the style tag contains the style rules inside it. And then you have external CSS which is a .css extension, and then you have style rules directly contained which does not contain the style tag inside it. So what's the advantage? Here you get advantages of CSS. So CSS by default have this advantages which we talked in the previous slide, that it gives you reusability, fine. So you have, they are reusable, fine. Then you have CSS which are maintainable, fine. Then you have CSS which increases readability and code readability, right? So all of these advantages you get with any CSS, let that be internal or let that be external. But when you say reusable, maintainable and readable with internal CSS, you only have restriction of this till a simple HTML page. Yes, your all style rules are reusable, maintainable, readable, but only within a single file. Right? Whereas if you talk about external CSS, they are reusable, maintainable and readable across pages, across different files, or across, I'll say, pages, because HTML files are nothing but pages. So this is a single file or a page, and here we have it across pages. That's what the advantage that we get with external. And mostly when you create your applications, websites, you go for an external .css rather than an internal one. Right? So when we are talking about using this CSS, we understand that internal and external are these two types of CSS. Internal and external both give you reusability, maintainability and readability. But if you talk about making use of it into your HTML page with an internal CSS, then the advantage is only restricted across a single file. Whereas if you talk about reusability, maintainability and readability in an external CSS, it's across different pages that you can use it into your web application. Right? So let's have a look at it. Fine. So we understand, Sumit. Yes, you have told us CSS as something which allows us to have styling, make our UI more presentable, and things like that we can achieve. I also understood that it contains internal, external. These are the types of it. But when you say you are writing style rules, fine. So let's say if I just select this, if I'm using style rules, what style rules I need to put in? I don't understand what are the different kind of style rules I need to put in. Is it a programming language? No, it's not something that will have any programming construct. It has a different syntax altogether, and that's what we're going to talk about. So CSS always talks in the form of what we call as a selector, and then the style rules going inside a selector. So let's talk about what selectors are. Now, before we move on to the selectors, let's understand that how do we make use of an internal style sheet, fine, and also we would be making sure that we are implementing this CSS selectors into our application, right? So let's understand that. Now let's go back and see how do we work with CSS. So I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it as module 10, and in module 10 I'm going to create a file which says Css Basics .html. Now, as we talked about not using any CSS, now let's say if this is a simple, which I'm using an input type. So I'll say input type equal to text, fine. I may not be giving any name and ID as of now. I'll just get rid of it. And what I do inline styling. So before using any CSS, I'll just use inline styling. And I say, let's say background color to be, say, light blue, right? That's my styling. Now, this is my inline styling that I'm using for all the input types. So let's say there are only 5. Right, and these input types, if I just viewed it my live server, they would all have the same styling being achieved. So that's their background color fine being changed to light blue. But as I said, this inline styling as we are using does not give you any reusability, because if tomorrow down the line I want the light blue to change to light green or maybe light coral, any of the values, then I need to copy and paste it or make a change or just search for light blue and then refresh it with a light green, and then the UI would change. So you can see this is not very reusable, right? And that's the reason why we try to avoid inline styling, and which is there. Now the second thing which you need to understand from CSS is, okay, if I'm not using this, then how do I apply styling? So let's consider only that we are having this input type, fine, which is input type equal to text, and I want to apply some styling using CSS. Now, as I've told you, you try to make use of the style tag, and within the style tag, what or how do you apply the styling are by using selectors. So let's see what these selectors are. So selectors, CSS selectors, are used to find or select the HTML elements you want to style. And there are simple selectors which are based on name, ID, and classes. As the name suggests, they are selectors. They are going to select something. And what they're going to select? They're actually going to select the HTML element that you want to style. So this HTML element that we are talking about, so this HTML element that we are talking about gives us a simple flexibility of using some styling, but based on to the selectors. Now, which selector, that will be dependent on whether you're talking element level or you're talking name level or you're talking ID level or you're talking class level. Okay. So these are the different kinds of selectors. We're going to see that implement practically, right? So let's understand how do we implement CSS selectors. Now there are 3 selectors which we have discussed on. One is the name. Now this name is one of the simplest selector to talk about. Okay. Now name meaning it has to be the exact same name of the item that you want to select. So what do selectors do? They select the element. They select the HTML element and then you apply some styling onto it. So the background color that we were wanting to change, so let's say again, if I go back and say light pink, fine, is the background color which I want. Now what this style rule will do, or this selector will do, it will select the element, fine, and then give the background color as light pink. So if I right click and say open with live server, you would find that your text box is having the pink as light pink as the background color being there. Now I will say, okay, what if I have a number of different text boxes? So let's say if I give a break statement for better UI, and I'll just paste. Now if I just go back, you would have all these input types having the same background color. Now here, maintainability is easy, because if now this product point that is already reusable, because you just defined it once into the style tag and it applied to all the input types. So if I just want to change this light pink to light gray, that is applied in a flash. Right? That's how you go back and make some changes into the styling. So that's your internal CSS. So internal CSS allows you to apply some styling to the elements within an HTML page. Now whatever you have written at an element level or a tag name level. That's what we call this selector as. But the thing with this selector is, it's like select star from in your SQL. So if there is any other input type, let's say you have an input type equal to button, and I'm going to say the value as, let's say, submit. Even this is going to have that color. And so if I just go back and say, let's say light green for that matter, you have input type equal to submit also having that color, because it selects anything from the tag name. Okay, we have a solution for that, but yes, this is what your CSS is going to do. So it's going to actually select all the input types based on the tag name. Right? And for that matter, what we do is we use different types of selector. Right? Now, maybe what I want is, I may be wanting to only have the first, or maybe let's say for example the scenario is these items, fine, okay, that we are talking about. Maybe for alternate items, fine, I want a different color, and for these items, fine, which are at, so let's say it's from 0, let's say, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So even I want something else. For odd, I want something else, right? Or maybe I may be selective that only first and last can have some different styling. So if I want this to be happening, right, then I would be using what we call as class level. So the second type of selector that we use is class level selector. So the class level selector allows me to select a particular element by what we call as a class name, right? Meaning, instead of generically applying this, what I do is I define a class. Now how do you define a class? Class, see, now do not confuse this class with object oriented concepts, because this class is completely different than the object oriented classes that you may have worked with. Okay? So when we talk about classes with CSS, it's denoted by using a dot, fine, it's preceded by using a dot, and then any class name, any name that you want to have. Now why we say it is a class? Because it's classifying some elements into a category. That's the reason why we say this is a class. And here I may say, let's say even, and in this even I may go back and just set the border. So I'll say border, let's say 1 pixel, say dashed, and let's say red in color. Now how do you select? Now if I just see this into my UI, you will see there is no styling. Now why there is no styling? Because this you have commented out. That's how you comment in CSS. Fine. So it's not a single. It's not something like this. This would not work with CSS comment. It has to be multi-line comment. Okay, as you put in with the forward slash and the asterisk, and then ended by asterisk and forward slash. And when you're using this even, this is a class. Now how do you apply it? Let's say I apply it by using an attribute called as class, and I'll say class even. Now if you remember, we did the same thing with Bootstrap when we worked with audio. So in audio, when we were doing it, we went ahead and said class is equal to If you remember this, in module 8, when we are doing the audio tag, in this, we went ahead and used this class is equal to glyphicon hyphen volume. Now, these things, we did not implement it. Who implemented it? Bootstrap implemented. We only consumed it. But some styling by default kicked in. So, for only those elements which I have to be very selective, I can go back and apply these classes. Now, there are two advantages. One, this makes it selective and not restrictive to any single element, right? Because if I'm using classes, let's say I go back and have even to be mentioned, I don't need to put a dot here because that's not what you're using it for applying. It's only for definition that you're using. And here you are only selecting that these text boxes which are marked with classes should only have that styling, right? So if I go back and make this as 2 pixels so that things, or maybe 3 pixels for that matter, so that they are shown in bold so that you're able to see, that's how your styling looks like. So only these items which are having the class is equal to being set are used for applying the styling. Now, because input type equal to button does not have that, I can even go back and select it. Now, even for that matter, I can have a div, and I'll say styled div. And in the style div, I can go back and say class is equal to even. So even the div will be styled by using what we have applied as a class. So the advantage here that you get is if you wanted to do this with the element level, what you would have to do is you would have to come back here and say input comma div. So for the elements that you're targeting, if you wanted this thing to be done by using your element level, then you have to put a comma separate list of all the elements which will have the same styling. But then, as I said, these are generic styles. Fine, it's a lowest level at which you can apply the styling, which is element level. They are very generic. Okay, and if you want all the elements to have some common kind of an styling, then ideally you go for element level rather than the class level. But for selective things, we ideally go for class level. Now, advantage here is I just need to define the class, and then in the HTML I have an authority where do I need to put this class as an attribute. And so it just has to be on the element to which you want to apply, and it does not matter which element you are applying it to, like it was there with the tag name. Fine, so that's your class level. And then we have an ID level. Now ID, as we have earlier used for identifying an element uniquely. So with this, what we can do is we can uniquely identify any particular item, right, based on to its unique ID. Now let me go back and have this first div tag as ID as first. And how do you define an ID? Like we define the class by using a dot, you precede the ID by saying an hash. I'll say hash of first and then give some, so here maybe I'll say color to be, let's say light blue, or even I'll just say dark blue, so that the value that you type into the text box is kind of blue in color, right? So here if I go back, I will not see anything into this UI, but the moment I start typing in, can you see instead of black now the color is blue. So for each of that, now only for that ID, but otherwise if I go back and type in something like this in here, that's not the style. So you can see the difference between these two items, fine, which are there. Okay, so any item that you type in will have that style applied, whereas here you will not have that style applied because that's not what we are pinpointing to. Now using IDs at multiple locations is wrong. For that you use classes. ID you only pinpoint to a particular item. Let's say for example you have an header of a page, that's only one kind of an header, fine. So you can just go back and have a page header to have an ID as an header, let's say, okay, and then you have the footer, fine, as an values, where you can just go back and have the IDs for each of these being given in. Okay. I'm not talking about the headers and footers of article and section, you can have that as well, but let's say normally anything, or maybe a logo, right, which you have. So like now, if you're talking about a web page to be created of your company, you'll only have one single logo. So that can be one single item into my page, and I can find that by an ID. So that's what are selectors. But I still didn't get a point. Why are they? Why is this called as cascaded style sheet or cascading style sheet? Now, why it is cascading style sheet? Because the styles cascade, means they are applied one after another. Right? To understand this, what I will do, the deliberate thing what I did here is I used different style rules for different levels of things, so that I can get rid of each of this and then see what style do we get applied. So what if I'm having element level, class level and ID level, right, for the items. Now if you have a look at the first element, which is this one, it has element level style, or should it be applied class level style, or should it be applied ID level style? Now to see this, if I save and come back into the UI, you actually see all of the items working together for the first item. So you can see that it is having the border. The border is coming from the class level. Then you have the background. The background is coming from the tag level, element level, and then you see this style is blue, fine, which is basically coming from the ID level. So here, when I go back and specify that, okay, these are the levels at which I can apply the cascaded style sheet, fine, we understand that cascading is applying of styles one after another. Now the question is, when you have input, class and ID being specified, okay, we have three different properties and we saw that all these three different properties are being applied. But now the question is, what if we have these style rules in which where we specify all the style rules to contain some simple styles which are kind of common. So if the style rules are different, which is I understand background color, border and color, so combination of all of these three things have made me understand that okay, style rules are being applied. And why it's cascading? Now before we move on to the common style rules, let's understand how do we read this style. So if I right click and go back to inspect, as I said, that's one of the important part where the developer will be investing his time on. So if I right click and go back to either a div tag or even this input element, I can select this input element, and if you have a look on the right hand side, that's your style section. Right now, just I'll be investing 2 minutes of your time to make you understand this because it's an important thing from an developer's perspective. Now the first thing which you see is element style. We'll come back to this. So this is inline styling, right? Second, you have the tag level, fine, where you are saying okay, the background color is green, fine. Now if at all to this input type, okay, that we are specifying, let's say I'll first select on the first one. Now this input type had the input element level, fine. This input type had two levels. One you can see is the class, and then you have the second, which is your tag level. But if I consider the first input type, which is having all these three things, have a look how is Chrome rendering these things in to you, right? So if I just zoom, so you're able to see this. Now the first thing that you will see is element style, which is not having anything. Second, you see the hash of first, which is your ID, is applied, and then you see the class being applied, and then you see the element being applied. Now why I'm telling you this, because which style will have any preference or will one style override another, for this we need to understand. Okay, so these are the three types of things that your browser will by default make use of to tell you what style will be having an effect. Now if suppose, let's come back to the problem that we were discussing, like if I'm going back and using some common properties. So let's go back and use this background color. Now in this background color you have light green, which is your input type as an element level. I come back here and again use same background color property but with a different background. right? So if I do this, if I save and come back, what you see is, you see items which are having the class level being overridden with the element, right? They can just use any of these, say, make it orange, right? Now all the elements which are having the class, they are having the background color as orange. Now have a closer look here. So you will have still the color for the first being there. So if this is the item that we are talking about, so you can still the color being set as blue, fine, that's there. But if at all I go back and see what is happening in this second and the third selector that we are having, can you see in the input selector tag name? Okay, here we are having the background color kind of crossed. Now why it is crossed? Because class level has just overridden the common style, which is the background color. Why? Because class is what, so if you want to talk into a CSS specific term, we say class is more specific. We calculate something called as specificity. So the precedence of class is higher than the element level. Always, whenever you have common attributes, common stylings in the class as well as the input or the element level, always the class will have a higher preference. Because if I get rid of this, that's the beauty of this developer tool. So if I just get rid of this, can you see turning to green? Why? Because that effect is still there, but it's being overridden by the class. But if I just take off this to see how my UI is looking like, and so I crossed it myself, then you see the input type kicking in, because that's also the style that would get applied or would get the preference. Right? Now, what if, okay, so I understand that I'm using the element level having the background color. I use even for background color as well, and I understand even is the class which is having a higher specificity. We'll talk about specificity in a moment, and then have this color to be overridden. But what if I go back and have again a background color, fine, to be, let's say, green. I'm just using different colors altogether so that we are visually able to see that. So instead of light green, it will be dark green if at all first is going to have a preference over it. So if I just save and come back, only for that element, okay, which is the first element, you could see hash of first is having the importance, because hash of first is having a higher specificity value as compared to the class level or even the element level. So if I take this off, class will have a preference. If I take this off, then the element will have the preference. Right? Okay. But so understand ID is having a higher specificity, okay, right, as compared to the class. Class is having a higher specificity as compared to the element level. Right? And now if I talk about this element.style, which is basically inline styling, now here's the beauty. You don't have to go to the code to actually change something. You can do it here itself. So in element.style, which is inline styling, the style attribute that we earlier saw, if I go back and change the background color to, I'll just give it as red, right, so that we see that value as an effect. So your inline styling is having the highest specificity, right? That's going to have it's going to override all the things which you may have written by using style rules, until unless you encounter a lot of important and things like that. So that I'm not going into. But yes, from a normal specificity, if you talk about, this is something which is going to have an highest specificity and is going to override all the common properties which you are going to have it. Okay, so element level is having the highest specificity. So we understand here, yes, that when we work with CSS, why they are called as cascading or cascading style sheet? Because when I work with styles applied to HTML elements, you have different specificity levels of every selector that you're using in. If it's an element level, it has a lower specificity as compared to class, which has again a lower specificity as compared to ID. And if you're using inline styling, that will override even the ID part. So that's how you can go back and define, okay, these are the different types of selectors which are there. Now these are 3 basic selectors. These are not the only selectors which are available. There are tons of other selectors as well. So you have attribute level selectors. So if you want to have a look at, you can obviously go back into Google and search for Css3 selectors, or Css selectors rather. We'll come back to Css3, and when I'm doing it, okay, so let's say if I go back and say Css selectors, I can get the list of Css selectors. So I'm going to the MDN site. So you can see what are selectors. We have met selectors already. A Css selector is a part of a CSS rule. Okay, it's a pattern of elements and other items in the browser that tell HTML and should be selected to apply the Css property. And we have seen the element level. So you have n number of ways in which you can have the selection to be done. Now, as we have seen 3 basic types, find the class, the ID. You also have attribute level selector. Find, you can see the element and then some attribute. So this is presence of an attribute. With this, you are checking the value of an attribute href equal to something. Then there are pseudo classes. This is an Css3 selector. Find p : first line. That's again a Css3 selector. You can have combination of selectors. So this is hierarchical selector. Fine, it's a child combinator. Fine, so for all the p's who are children of article. So these are the selectors. Now here you can just go back and use any of these selectors as well. Okay, you can just explore more onto it. So you have the type selector, universal selector, let's say star. Find class selector by saying dot of something, ID selector that we use hash of something, attribute, first child, first line, okay, then descendant by using space, child by using an greater than sign. Find h1 plus p is an adjacent sibling. Find h1 tilde p is basically an general sibling. So all these are different selectors. And when you talk about versions of CSS, you have Css 3 as a latest version of CSS, which also gives you more selectors. So like this first child, find nth child, find these are all different types of selectors. Even this first line that you see, the pseudo element selector and pseudo class, these are new features of Css 3. So Css 3 is a newer feature of, or rather this is a newer version which brings up some newer features to the web, and that's what we're going to talk about next. But before we do that, let me tell you how do we calculate the specificity, right? So if I talk about using specificity or calculating the specificity, I have a general rule. Now if you see, I'll just go back and you can search for, close this down, I can just search for CSS specificity in Google, and the second link which pops out, which is cssprex.com. okay, it's a site basically that helps you with more on the CSS things. You can even go to MDN and do that, but because they showed the things graphically, I wanted to show this thing to you. So calculating CSS specificity value, and that's how you calculate. Fine, so there are 4 boxes as you can see, and these 4 boxes allow you to calculate the specificity of it. Okay, so if you are given any style rule, then if that style rule fits, if it contains elements, then you will just increment a value to it. If it contains a pseudo class or an attribute, you will again increment a value to it. If it contains an ID, fine, then you will say again add 1 to it. If it's having a style, then you will add 1 to it. Now how many number of things you're having, you're just going to go back and have the things being listed down in here. Okay, so that was just an example. So let's see an example practically to work with it. So if I'm going back and seeing how do I calculate, now this is one example that they have given, right? How do I calculate the specificity of this style rule? Now you will see, oops, sorry, this style rule consists of UL. Okay, so let's consider or count the number of elements. So how many number of elements you are having? This is UL, fine, this is LI, and this is A. So in the element section, they have made an entry of 3, right? Then in your class, so it is having a class, yes, it's having a class which is active. So that's why they have made an entry 1, fine, that's an entry. Then does it have an ID? Yes, it has an ID. So UL has an ID nav, hash of nav is 1, and that's why this is 1. Does it have any style attribute? Fine, any attribute, like as we have seen, attribute is given by like this, the square bracket, fine. So no, that's not there. So that's the reason why you have 0. Now you just need to read this as 1, 1, 3. Right? Now suppose if I have another style tag which does not contain this A. Now if it does not contain this A and the rest is everything else same as what we are having, now the value would come down to 1, 1, 2. Now is 113 higher than 112? Yes. And that's the reason why this will have the style effect. That's how you calculate a specificity of any style rule being given. Right? So you can explore more onto the specificity. It's much of a deeper topic to explore. Okay, but yes, I've given you an overview and I've shown you the path that you can go on and explore more onto what specificity means and understand which style rule will be getting applied into the browser. Right? So that's how we make use of specificity. Now, here after this, what we talk about is ecosystem of CSS. So once you're done with the selectors, we're going to talk about the ecosystem and CSS applications as well, right? So if you talk about the ecosystem of CSS, not only JavaScript has evolved, not only HTML has evolved, but even CSS has evolved, to contain some of its ecosystem being there, right? Like you have what we call as CSS Preprocessors. So here, what you're seeing here, less and Sas, they are called as CSS Preprocessors. We'll talk about them. Now what these preprocessors are, preprocessors allow you to have language advantages coming to CSS as a language. Now we cannot go back and have a variable into CSS because it's just selectors and style rule, selectors and style rule. That's it, what is there to CSS. But less and Sas, fine. So I'm going to talk about, so less and Sas are having the full form. So syntactically awesome style sheet is what Sas basically stands for, and less is basically again a Css processors which contains some variable creation, inheritance, and all of these things. So what these Css preprocessors do, they bring language advantages to the CSS. So you're writing kind of in CSS, but they are called as Css preprocessor for a reason, because once you write a Sas file, fine, or a less file, which that's an extension that you give, you need to compile them, and they emit out .css as an output. So this goes as an input, this comes as an output. Right? So we need to understand that when we talk about CSS ecosystem, not only writing style sheets are important, but as a web developer, you should understand that there are some CSS preprocessors that give advantage. So we'll talk about what are the advantages of it, okay, in short while. Then we talked about Bootstrap. Okay, if you remember, we use Bootstrap in the audio tag. So Bootstrap is an implementation. It's not a CSS processor, but it's an application of CSS, because Twitter has made some styles, made some classes, and made it available for use, and that's the reason why this Bootstrap is also called as Twitter Bootstrap. Right? Okay, so that's an application. So your Twitter has gone ahead, written the style sheets, and made it available to you so that you can use it into your project as well. So if you want Twitter like styling, you can go back and make use of Twitter Bootstrap. Then again, these are again CSS features, like using, like we had the CSS preprocessor. On the same lines, you have this also as another. Now here with Bootstrap, you can also go back and make use of CSS preprocessors as well. Bootstrap gives you that flexibility, or you can just go back and even use the .css file for that matter. So Compass, Styler, these are again different applications of CSS to be used. So let's understand how do we make use of them, or how do we go back and use this less and Sas. What advantage do we get? Okay. Now if I talk about making use of this Sas and less, so I just search for Sas. So you can search on SASS, which is syntactically awesome style sheet. And if you open up the first link, that's where you'll end up. Okay. So you can see CSS with powers, okay, superpowers. And what you see with Sass when you search, you can see Sass is a preprocessor scripting language that is interpreted or compiled into Cascaded style sheets. So Sass script is a scripting language itself, and Sass consists of two syntaxes. We'll talk about two syntaxes, but that's a preprocessor. So you have different extensions that you can use. Sass and SCSS, both are same, fine, not a problem. And when you actually, so they're again open source, you can go back and use, you can see they are MIT license, and you can just go back and use it in your project, and that's available for you to use it. So what this syntactically awesome style sheet is, the reason I'm not discussing on less, because that was a previous way how we did that, but now everyone is more focusing on the Sass because it gives you more features as compared to the less language that we had. So here, when we talk about Sass, it's a most mature, stable and powerful professional grade CSS extension language in the world. Okay, so it's basically CSS processor. They call it as CSS extension, but it's also a CSS preprocessor. So what advantage do we get? Right? What advantage do we get? The first advantage is if I just go back and say learn Sass, you can even go to the documentation and explore. Fine. So yes, they have talked about installing the Sass and other things. We'll talk about it later. But what I want to focus on are these points. The first thing that you see is you can make use of variables. Before this, before less and Sass came in, we didn't had any way of creating variables in CSS. Now what we are doing is we are not writing CSS, but we are writing CSS kind of stuff, right? So let's say if I'm using a variable, so what advantage do I have if I'm using variables? Obviously variables increases reusability, right? So what I can do, if I am using some variable, like I'm using a font stack, or maybe I'm using some color. Let's say the color is this hash of 33, fine, everywhere. Now there are different selectors. Let's say there are 100 selectors in which I have used color as hash of 333. But then I decide not to have 333, but let's say FFF, make it everything white, fine, or 000, make everything as black. I want to change the color. I want to change the color to red. If I have to do that, I have to physically go back to every style rule in the selector that is there and make the value from hash of 333 to FFF or 000. Right? That's in the hex value that you are giving it. But if we have variables, we have the flexibility of having a maintainable code. We have a flexibility of reusable code, because if I just make change at one single location, okay, it can reflect on all different style rules. Now I'm not intending to cover everything because this itself is a deeper topic, but I wanted you to understand that only knowing CSS is not important. You need to understand that there exists some ecosystem revolving around CSS, and using Sass or less is one of the key tool that a web developer now should be having in. Right? Then if I just scroll down, you can have nestings. You can have nav. Now you can see there are two syntaxes, SCSS, SASS. Now what's the difference? If you see SASS, which is basically the first way or the older way of referring with the things, this SASS is focusing more on indentation. So if I just zoom, so you're able to see that in a more better manner. Now here, when I try to make use of this nav, and then I have the indentation, and this indentation is by using tabs and a new line. Right? Now if you go wrong, then your style rule also gets hampered, right, when the CSS is getting generated. And that's the reason why they came up with SCSS, which uses braces instead of indentation for creating the style rules. So everyone uses braces and not the indentation ideally, because that's increasing the readability, and as well as you don't have to remember how many spaces and tabs you need to go back and use. Then you can have partials, okay, modules from reusability. Fine, you can go back and make use of reference to something. So this base.scss will be replaced in here. Then you can extend, mix in. Fine, just call something like function. Fine, so this transform is a function that they have written at the rate mixin. Fine, pass some values. This will be generated, okay, and then that will be replaced into this dot box as end class. So this is the final output that you will get when you compile your Sas or SCSS to your CSS. Now there are Sas compilers, fine, which are available, and that was there, okay, which was there listed earlier. We'll just come back to that. So you can extend, inherit, find all of this. So you can see @extend, @extend. Fine, all these are things which you get in. You can even get operators, fine, to calculate the width or something like that. Fine, that can also be done by using Sas. Right? Now, how do you convert? Now, how do you convert is this Sas is present as an npm package. Fine, so you need to have node installed. Once you have node installed, so node we can use it for tooling purposes. And then what you can do is, once you have the Sas being installed, then you can go back and use this Sas, fine, have the input.scss and give the css file. If you don't give the name of the css file, then it will take the same name as your input as well. Right, so it's going to go back and create an output.css. So browsers are not meant to work with less and Sas. It's only at the development time that a developer uses Css preprocessors. It builds up those CSS, emits out the CSS, it's built up those Sas, emit out the CSS, and then use that CSS into your project. Right? But in the development time, you can surely go back and make use of less and Sas. So that's about Css preprocessors. Right? So that was just an overview. If you want to dig onto it, you can surely go back to saslang.com/guide. Now, talking about CSS 3 features. Now, there are different CSS 3 features available. Okay, some of the major changes that we'll be discussing now. Again, then we'll be ending up the session discussing on all the ecosystem things that we have discussed on. So this CSS 3 features that we're talking about, as I said, CSS 3 is the latest version of CSS as a standard, and it brings much of the things to the table, like HTML5 and audio and video tag gave you a way of not having third-party libraries for playing something or performing any audio and video tags to be directly played in. On the same lines, you have CSS 3 not having any dependency to include into your web, because this is now coming out of the box by using web. Okay? Like if you wanted to have applications to be mobile ready, then we used to use jQuery mobile, but now there is something called as media queries. Fine. So in this media queries, we can actually go back and make use of those queries to be responsive to different devices that the user is viewing your application in. Fine. So there are tons of CSS features. Some of it I'll just be listing down. So you can see box shadow, opacity, rounded corners, attributes, selectors, new colors. Okay, some fonts that are being added, and you'll also see media queries being there as well. So you can see from user interface, some box model selectors, new selectors which are added from backgrounds, borders, media queries, fine. Then transforms, fine. Any animations that you want to put in, you can do that. Any transformations that you want to do, change the scaling and things like that, rotate, all of these effects you can do it by using transform. Now these are provided to you out of the box by using CSS 3. Fine. Now to cover these features, obviously that's a deeper concept to talk about, but yes, right now I just wanted to list you down that these are the advantages, fine, that you get when you're working with the CSS 3, which you don't have to depend on any third-party library, fine, for performing some actions onto the web. It is now present out of the box by using web. And as I've told you, as we are using HTML test for CSS 3 features, I can just go back and say, can I use, and if I just go back to caniuse.com, it will tell you whether your browser can support CSS 3 features. Fine. So if I just go back and type in media queries, you can see, type in there, so media queries. Okay, fine, not a problem. All these APIs are being there, but surely I can go back and make use of media queries. Or can I use @media into this? That would be showing you whether I can use @media or not. Any of the CSS 3 features, whether I can go back and use border radius. Okay. So if I say border -radius, it will be letting me know. Okay, back. Okay, yeah, it's kind of slow. Okay. Okay, so you can even see for search features in here as well. So for flexbox, Css grid, can you use Css grid in here, and what levels of the browser it is supporting in. You get all the features present in here as well. Right, so you can see Firefox, Chrome, fine, from 86, 88, it's supporting all the grid. Safari, fine, even your Firefox, fine, Opera, all are IE, fine, it's being supporting these as well. Edge is supporting in that. Fine, in 11 you have some partial support, fine, with the prefix, vendor prefix, ms hyphen. So all these is what you can do with caniuse.com, okay, for Css 3 features specifically. So HTML5 s.com will surely take you that there. But if you are more interested in Css 3 features, you can just check that one. So you can explore more on the campus as well as stylus, which are again on the same lines of your Sas and even the Bootstrap that we have used. So that's what we have discussed. What is CSS? Fine. So we saw CSS is nothing but cascading style sheets, which basically allows you to apply stylings to your HTML elements. Fine. We have seen different levels at which we can apply. We talked about selectors. We talked about different types of CSS, internal CSS, external CSS that we can use in, and then we have also discussed on the CSS ecosystem, where we discussed on Css Preprocessors, and we also had application of Css which was Bootstrap, and there are tons of other Css things also available which are forming the Css ecosystem, right? Fine. So this concludes our course, fine, with the last module being covered today, right? So I thank you all for being patient, and hope this was some value addition to your knowledge. And please please don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you. See you in the next module. Thank you.